There is a moment in every person's life when they realize the version of reality they were handed by schools, by governments, by institutions, was never the complete picture. For most people, that moment arrives slowly, like a fog lifting over years of quiet questioning. But for some, it hits all at once, like a door swinging open that was never supposed to be found. This video is that door. What you are about to hear is not speculation. It is not the product of conspiracy forums or fringe imagination. It is the convergence of declassified military documents, testimony from credentialed professionals, ancient records that were never properly explained, and a pattern so consistent across cultures and centuries that dismissing it requires more faith than accepting it. Because here is what the mainstream narrative has never been able to answer. Why do the oldest civilizations on Earth, completely isolated from one another, separated by oceans and thousands of miles, all describe the same beings, the same craft, the same encounters with intelligences that came from the sky? The Sumerians didn't call them gods out of ignorance. They called them gods because no other word in their vocabulary could contain what they were witnessing. The Egyptians encoded them in their architecture with such mathematical precision that we still cannot fully replicate it today. The Dogon tribe in West Africa held detailed astronomical knowledge about Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye, centuries before modern telescopes confirmed its existence. These are not coincidences. These are data points. And when you connect them, a picture emerges that changes everything. But this is not a history lesson. This is a present tense awakening. Right now, as you watch this, the United States government is sitting on a body of evidence so significant that multiple congressional hearings have been held behind closed doors to discuss it. David Grush, a decorated intelligence officer, testified under oath before Congress that the U.S. has been running a secret program for decades to retrieve and reverse engineer non-human craft. He used those exact words, non-human, knowing the legal consequences of lying to Congress. That is not a YouTube rumor. That is a man with a security clearance, a military record, and everything to lose, telling the world what he knows. Luis Elizondo, former head of the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, has been saying the same thing for years. Commander David Fravor, a Navy pilot with over 18 years of flight experience, watched something off the coast of San Diego perform maneuvers no known aircraft can execute. No propulsion, no wings, no exhaust, moving at speeds that shatter every physical model we have. He reported it. It was documented, and for over a decade, that report sat buried in classified files. Why does this matter to you personally? Because what is coming is not just a political shift or a scientific revision. It is a philosophical earthquake. Every human being on this planet will be forced to confront the most fundamental questions of existence. Who built us? Where we truly come from? And what our place is in a universe that is far more populated than we were ever allowed to believe. Now let us go deeper. Because the surface of this conversation is only the beginning, and the people who stop at the headlines never get to the part that truly changes them. When archaeologists first uncovered the Sumerian clay tablets in the 19th century, they were not prepared for what they found. These tablets, some of the oldest written records in human history, described in extraordinary detail a race of beings called the Anunnaki. Beings who descended from the sky, who possessed knowledge far beyond the civilization they encountered, and who interacted directly with early humans in ways that the scribes of that era had no framework to invent. They were not writing mythology. They were writing history. The distinction matters enormously, because for centuries the academic establishment chose to classify these accounts as religious allegory, as primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena, as anything other than what the texts themselves claim to be. Eyewitness records of contact with non-human intelligence. The same pattern repeats in Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley, in ancient China, in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. The Vedic texts of ancient India describe flying craft called vimanas, in technical detail that has no parallel in any other literature of that era. These were not metaphors. The texts describe propulsion systems, aerial combat, and navigational principles that read more like engineering specifications than sacred poetry. The Book of Enoch, removed from the canonical Bible but preserved in Ethiopian Orthodox tradition and among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describes in precise language the descent of beings called the Watchers, entities who came from beyond the sky, who taught humanity astronomy, metallurgy, and the arts of war, and whose presence fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization. Why were these texts marginalized? Why were they pushed to the edges of academic discourse, labeled apocryphal, classified as mythology, or simply ignored? That is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Because the pattern of suppression is itself a form of evidence. When institutions consistently and aggressively dismiss a particular category of information across centuries and across cultures, that consistency is not neutral. It is a signal. And people who have learned to read signals understand that what is most aggressively denied is often closest to what is most consequential. Consider the case of the Nazca lines in Peru. Enormous geometric figures carved into the desert plateau, some stretching for miles, only fully visible and comprehensible from the air. Created by a civilization that, according to mainstream archaeology, had no flight capability. The official explanation, that these were ceremonial pathways, that the Nazca people created them as offerings to sky gods by walking the lines, has always been structurally insufficient. You do not need to be a scientist to recognize that creating a massive figure of a hummingbird or a condor that only makes visual sense from several thousand feet above the ground requires either the ability to see from that height or the knowledge that something capable of that perspective would be observing them. Neither option fits comfortably inside the standard academic narrative. Both options point somewhere else entirely. Or consider Pumapunku, part of the Tiwanaku complex in Bolivia, sitting at an altitude of nearly 13,000 feet above sea level. The stone blocks at this site, some weighing over 100 tons, display precision cuts and interlocking joints that modern engineers have struggled to explain using tools available to the civilization credited with building it. The surfaces are machined to tolerances that even today require advanced equipment to replicate. The stones were quarried miles away and transported to this altitude without, according to the conventional timeline, the wheel or iron tools. And yet there they sit, silent and immovable, asking a question that the textbooks have never adequately answered. These are not isolated anomalies. They are part of a global pattern of architectural and astronomical achievement that consistently exceeds what our current model of human development can account for. And this pattern does not emerge from conspiracy websites. It emerges from the physical evidence itself, from measurements, from geological surveys, from engineering analyses conducted by credentialed professionals who looked at the data and found themselves unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught. Now bring that thread forward in time, because the same phenomenon that left its fingerprints across the ancient world did not simply disappear. It adapted. It continued. And in the 20th century it began to intersect with the machinery of the modern nation-state in ways that created an entirely new category of suppression. The year 1947 is a pivot point in this story. In the summer of that year, something crashed near Roswell, New Mexico. What happened in the days that followed has been documented, debated, and deliberately obscured for nearly 8 decades. The initial press release from the Roswell Army Airfield stated explicitly that a flying disc had been recovered. That press release was issued by the base's public information officer, a military professional whose job was to communicate official positions accurately. Within 24 hours, that statement was retracted and replaced with the now famous weather balloon explanation. The witnesses, military personnel, ranchers, local officials, were instructed to stay silent. Some reported being threatened. The wreckage was transported under military escort. And a story that should have been the most significant news event in human history was buried under layers of institutional denial that have persisted to this day. But Roswell was not the end. It was a beginning. In the decades that followed, a classified infrastructure grew up around the phenomenon. Programs with names like Project Sign, Project Grudge, Project Blue Book, and eventually programs so deeply classified that their names were not publicly known until whistleblowers began to come forward in the 21st century. These programs were not simply monitoring unexplained aerial phenomena. According to multiple independent sources with direct access to classified information, they were actively retrieving craft, analyzing materials of non-terrestrial origin, and in some cases, working to understand and replicate the technology they had recovered. The implications of this are staggering. If true, and the weight of testimony and documentation now makes the alternative increasingly difficult to defend, then the most transformative technological secret in human history has been held by a small group of unelected, unaccountable individuals for the better part of a century. Energy technology, propulsion technology, material science, medical applications. All of it potentially sitting in classified facilities while humanity has continued to burn fossil fuels, fight resource wars, and struggle with problems that may have had solutions for decades. This is the part of the conversation that moves people from curiosity into something deeper. Because it is one thing to entertain the idea that extraterrestrial life exists somewhere in the cosmos. It is another thing entirely to sit with the possibility that the evidence of that life has been actively concealed from you, from all of us, and that the concealment has had direct consequences for the quality of life on this planet. But here is where this channel takes a different path from the standard UFO discourse. Because the goal is not to make you angry. The goal is not to send you spiraling into helplessness or conspiracy paralysis. The goal is to equip you with a framework for understanding what is unfolding, so that when the disclosure accelerates, and it is accelerating, you are not caught unprepared. You are not one of the people standing in the wreckage of their worldview with no map and no compass. You are one of the people who saw it coming, who did the work, who built the internal architecture necessary to integrate this information without being destabilized by it. Because make no mistake, the disclosure is happening. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way that science fiction prepared us for. Not with landing craft on the White House lawn and a presidential address to a stunned global audience. It is happening the way all truly significant shifts happen, incrementally, through testimony and documentation and institutional acknowledgement, through the slow accumulation of evidence that eventually reaches a threshold beyond which denial becomes more costly than admission. We are approaching that threshold. The 2017 New York Times article that revealed the existence of the Pentagon's secret UFO program was a threshold moment. The subsequent admission by the Department of Defense that the videos released, the tic-tac, the gimbal, the go-fast, were authentic was a threshold moment. The 2023 congressional testimony of David Grush was a threshold moment. Each of these events moved the Overton window. Each of them made the next revelation slightly easier to absorb, and the pattern of escalating official acknowledgement that has characterized the past decade shows no sign of reversing. What does all of this mean for you, sitting here right now, watching this video on a device that would have looked like alien technology to someone living 100 years ago? It means that you are alive at the most consequential moment in recorded human history. It means that the questions your ancestors encoded in stone and scripture, who are we, where do we come from, are we alone, are about to receive answers that no generation before yours has had access to. It means that the story of humanity is larger, stranger, and more magnificent than anything you were taught in school. And it means that the way you choose to engage with that story, the quality of attention you bring to it, the intellectual honesty you apply to the evidence, the courage you summon to follow the truth wherever it leads, matters more right now than it ever has before. This is not entertainment. This is orientation. This is the process of preparing yourself for a world that is already in the process of becoming something new. There are people in positions of power right now who are having conversations about how to release this information without causing panic. There are scientists who have signed non-disclosure agreements that prevent them from publishing what they know. There are military personnel who have carried classified knowledge for decades and are now, in the final chapters of their lives, choosing to speak. And there are ordinary people, pilots, police officers, farmers, teachers, who have had direct encounters with phenomena they cannot explain, who have reported what they witnessed, and who have been dismissed, ridiculed, or silenced for doing so. Their experiences matter. Their testimony is part of the evidence. And the consistency of what they describe across decades and across continents, craft that perform impossible maneuvers, beings that communicate in ways that bypass language, encounters that leave physical traces and psychological imprints that last for decades, is not the product of mass delusion. It is the product of contact. Repeated, ongoing, deliberate contact with a presence that has been here far longer than our civilization, and that operates on a timeline we are only beginning to understand. This channel is dedicated to that understanding, to building it carefully, rigorously, without the sensationalism that has historically made this subject easy to dismiss. Because the truth does not need to be sensationalized. It is, on its own terms, the most extraordinary story ever told, and it belongs to every human being on this planet equally. If you are still watching at this point in the video, you already know that something in you recognizes what is being said here. That recognition is not accidental. It is the beginning of something. Honor it, follow it, and whatever you do not turn away from it now. Leave the word contact in the comments. Let others who are watching know that they are not alone in this. Hit the like button and share this with someone who is ready to hear it. If this work has value to you, support it through Super Chat, because independent research that answers to no corporate interest and no government agenda is rare, and it exists only because people who understand its value choose to sustain it. This is only the first layer. The next one goes deeper. Stay with us. Let us talk about what is actually happening right now, not in the abstract, not in the language of possibility and speculation, but in the concrete, documented, verifiable reality of the present moment. Because one of the most effective tools of suppression has always been the relocation of this conversation into the realm of the hypothetical, the suggestion that all of this is somewhere out there, in the future, in the realm of what might be true, of what we cannot yet confirm. That relocation is itself a strategy, and understanding it is essential to understanding why most people are still not paying attention. The UAP Disclosure Act of 2023 was passed by the United States Congress. Read that sentence again slowly. The United States Congress, the legislative body of the most powerful government on earth, passed a law specifically designed to compel the executive branch to disclose information about unidentified anomalous phenomena. The fact that this law exists, that it was debated, written, and passed by elected officials in the most public legislative body in the world, tells you something fundamental about where we are. This is not fringe legislation proposed by one eccentric congressman from a rural district. This was supported by members of both parties, by senior members of the Armed Services Committee, by people with access to classified briefings that you and I are not permitted to see. They wrote the law because they know something, and what they know is significant enough that they felt the weight of a legal instrument was necessary to begin the process of bringing it into public view. Senator Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, was one of the primary architects of that legislation. He has stated publicly that the American people deserve to know the truth about UAPs and that the current level of secrecy is no longer justified. These are not the words of a man chasing headlines. These are the words of a man who has been briefed, who has seen documentation, and who has reached the conclusion that the information belongs to the public. When the Senate Majority Leader of the United States is co-authoring legislation about extraterrestrial disclosure, the conversation has permanently left the territory of fringe speculation. And yet most people are not paying attention. Most people scrolled past that news the same way they scroll past everything, quickly, shallowly, without allowing it to land. Because the architecture of modern information consumption is not designed to help people process genuinely significant information. It is designed to keep them moving, to prevent the kind of sustained, concentrated attention that genuine understanding requires. This channel is a deliberate interruption of that pattern. The intention here is to slow down, to go deep, to stay with the evidence long enough for it to actually mean something. So let us stay with it. Let us look at what the evidence is actually showing us when we examine it, without the filter of institutional dismissal or the distortion of sensationalist media. The materials recovered from non-human craft, and the existence of such materials has now been testified to under oath by multiple individuals with direct knowledge, display properties that our current science cannot account for, isotopic ratios that do not match anything found naturally on Earth, metamaterials with structural properties that exceed the theoretical limits of anything we know how to manufacture, alloys that respond to stimuli in ways that suggest they are not passive materials but active systems, materials that behave in some sense as though they are alive. These descriptions come not from anonymous internet sources, but from scientists and engineers who have worked directly with these materials under government contract, who have signed non-disclosure agreements and in some cases have broken those agreements because they believe the information is too important to remain hidden. Dr. Hal Puthoff is one of the most credentialed physicists working in this area. His work on zero-point energy and his involvement with the Defense Intelligence Agency's research programs have put him in direct contact with materials and data that exist at the intersection of theoretical physics and recovered non-human technology. He has spoken publicly about the extraordinary nature of what he has examined. He does not speak in the breathless language of UFO enthusiasts. He speaks in the careful, precise language of a scientist who has looked at something that does not fit inside any existing framework and is working to build a new one. The implications of functional metamaterials with properties beyond our manufacturing capacity are not abstract. They represent a potential technological revolution of a scale that makes the Industrial Revolution look like a minor adjustment. Energy systems that draw from the quantum vacuum rather than burning combustible materials. Propulsion mechanisms that interact with space-time itself rather than pushing against it with thrust. Communication technologies that operate outside the electromagnetic spectrum as we currently understand it. If even a fraction of what has been described in classified settings is accurate, then the gap between what humanity currently has access to and what has been recovered and studied in secret is not a gap in degree. It is a gap in kind. It is the difference between a stone axe and a microprocessor. And here's what that means for every person alive today. The energy crisis is not inevitable. The resource conflicts that have shaped the geopolitical landscape of the 20th and 21st centuries are not the natural consequence of human limitation. They are, at least in part, the consequence of a technological suppression that has kept humanity dependent on systems that benefit those who control them. Oil, natural gas, nuclear fission. The entire architecture of the modern energy economy rests on scarcity, on the fact that the energy sources we use are finite and unevenly distributed. If the technology recovered from non-human craft offers access to energy sources that are effectively limitless and universally available, then the economic and political structures built on scarcity become obsolete overnight. That is not a small thing. That is a revolution of a kind that the people who benefit most from the current arrangement have every conceivable incentive to prevent. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the straightforward application of incentive analysis to a documented situation. Follow the money, follow the power. Ask who benefits from the continuation of the current energy paradigm and who would lose if it were disrupted. The answers to those questions tell you a great deal about why the suppression has been so thorough and so sustained. But the technological dimension, as significant as it is not the deepest layer of this story. It is not even close to the deepest layer. Because the beings who built those craft, who have been interacting with humanity across millennia, who have left their fingerprints in our ancient texts and our megalithic architecture and our genetic code, those beings raise questions that go far beyond energy policy and geopolitics. They raise questions about the nature of consciousness, about the structure of reality, about the meaning of what it means to be human in a universe populated by intelligences that have been traveling between star systems while we were still learning to write. The contact phenomenon, the direct personal encounters that thousands of individuals have reported across decades and across cultures, consistently points toward a dimension of this story that the nuts and bolts UFO discourse tends to avoid. The beings encountered are not simply technologically advanced versions of ourselves. They do not operate primarily through the physical and material channels that define our mode of existence. Encounters consistently involve telepathic communication, the direct transmission of information, emotion, and imagery without the medium of language. They involve alterations of consciousness that witnesses describe as more real than ordinary waking reality. They involve the transmission of knowledge, sometimes technical, sometimes philosophical, sometimes deeply personal, that the recipient had no prior access to and cannot account for through any conventional mechanism. Dr. John Mack was a Pulitzer Prize-winning psychiatrist and professor at Harvard Medical School. He spent the latter decades of his career conducting rigorous clinical interviews with individuals who reported contact experiences. His methodology was impeccable. His credentials were beyond reproach. And his conclusion, arrived at after years of careful clinical work, was that the experiences reported by his subjects were not the product of mental illness, fantasy, or deception. They were, in some sense, that his psychiatric framework was not equipped to fully accommodate real. He could not explain them, but he was honest enough to say so. And his honesty cost him. The institutional pressure he faced for taking this research seriously was significant and sustained. That pressure is itself a form of evidence. You do not bring the weight of institutional authority to bear against a line of inquiry unless that inquiry is getting close to something important. What the contact experiences consistently describe, across cultures and across decades, is a presence that is not simply visiting from another planet the way a human explorer might visit a foreign continent. It is a presence that is deeply, intimately entangled with the development of human consciousness. The messages transmitted in contact experiences are not primarily about technology or about interplanetary relations. They are about the nature of the self, about the relationship between individual consciousness and the larger field of awareness in which it exists, about the extraordinary, almost incomprehensible fact that consciousness is not produced by the brain, but is the fundamental substrate of reality, that awareness is not something that emerges from matter, but something that matter emerges from. This is where the extraterrestrial conversation meets the oldest and deepest currents of human spiritual and philosophical tradition. The mystics of every culture have always said that the boundaries of the self are not where they appear to be, that the sense of being a separate, isolated individual consciousness is a kind of limitation, useful for navigating the physical world, but fundamentally misleading about the nature of what we actually are. The contact phenomenon is, among other things, a transmission of that same understanding delivered through a channel that bypasses the filters of cultural conditioning and institutional authority. It lands directly in the nervous system of the person experiencing it and leaves them changed in ways they often cannot fully articulate but never forget. Whitley Strieber has been one of the most articulate and intellectually serious chroniclers of this dimension of the phenomenon. His encounters, beginning in the 1980s and continuing for decades, have produced a body of writing that is unlike anything else in this field, simultaneously rigorous and visionary, intellectually honest about what cannot be known while refusing to retreat into the comfortable agnosticism of indefinite suspension of judgment. His description of the beings he encountered as not simply extraterrestrial in the conventional sense, but as something that operates at the intersection of the physical and the non-physical, the material and the consciousness-based, points toward a framework that is beginning to find support in the most advanced reaches of contemporary physics and neuroscience. The simulation hypothesis, which has moved from the fringes of philosophical speculation into mainstream scientific discourse in recent years, suggests that what we experience as physical reality may be a form of information processing, a simulation, in the broadest sense of the term, running on a substrate we do not yet understand. If that framework has any validity, then the distinction between physical and non-physical, between extraterrestrial and interdimensional, between alien and angelic, begins to dissolve. What we have been calling extraterrestrial contact may be better understood as an interaction with intelligences that operate at a level of the computational hierarchy above the one we inhabit. Beings who are not simply from another star system, but from another layer of reality, a layer in which the constraints of space and time that define our experience do not apply in the same way. This is speculative. Let that be clearly stated. But it is speculative in the way that the best science has always been speculative. It is a framework that makes sense of the evidence, that has predictive power, and that opens new lines of inquiry rather than closing them down. And it is increasingly the framework that the most serious researchers in this field, from across disciplines, are converging on. The question is not simply whether extraterrestrial life exists. That question has effectively been answered. The question is, what kind of universe we actually live in. What is the nature of the intelligence that has been present in our sky, in our ancient records, and in the direct experience of thousands of human beings across the full span of recorded history? What does its presence mean for our understanding of consciousness, of reality, of what we are and what we are capable of becoming? These are not questions with simple answers. They are questions that will occupy the most serious thinkers of the coming decades and centuries. But the process of engaging with them, honestly, rigorously, without the defensive closure of either credulous belief or reflexive dismissal, is itself transformative. It is a form of intellectual and spiritual expansion that reshapes the person who undertakes it in ways that are difficult to predict in advance, but impossible to miss in retrospect. That is what this channel is for. Not to hand you a set of conclusions to adopt, but to create the conditions in which your own understanding can grow into something larger than what you brought with you when you first pressed play. That growth is the point. Everything else is secondary. Leave a comment. Tell us what shifted for you in this video. Ask the question that has been sitting in the back of your mind since you started watching. The conversation in the comments section of this channel is part of the content. It is part of the collective process of sense-making that this moment in history requires. Your voice matters here. Drop the word contact if you felt something move in you. Share this video with someone who is ready. There is a question that every person who goes deep enough into this subject eventually arrives at. Not the question of whether they are real. Not the question of whether the government has been hiding something. Those questions at this point have answers that are available to anyone willing to look honestly at the evidence. The question that waits at the bottom of all of this, the one that does not resolve easily and does not permit comfortable evasion, is this. What does it change about how you live? Because information without integration is just noise. And there is no shortage of noise in the world right now. What is rare, genuinely, urgently rare, is the capacity to take something that fundamentally disrupts your model of reality and allow it to actually land. To let it do what it came to do. To permit it to reorganize the way you understand yourself, your world, your place in the story that is unfolding around you right now, whether you are paying attention or not. The extraterrestrial truth is not an external event waiting to happen to you. It is already woven into the fabric of everything you have ever experienced. The instinct that told you from childhood that the official story was incomplete. The moments of inexplicable knowing, of synchronicity so precise it could not be dismissed as coincidence, of contact in dreams or in waking life with a presence that felt older and vaster than anything your cultural framework had given you language to describe. These were not malfunctions of your perception. They were data, and they were pointing here, to this conversation, to this expanding circle of human beings who are choosing, in this extraordinary moment in history, to stop pretending that the small story is sufficient. The small story says you are a biological accident on an unremarkable planet in an indifferent universe, that consciousness is a byproduct of electrochemical processes in an organ that will eventually stop working, that history is a linear march of progress from primitive ignorance toward technological sophistication, and that the proper response to existence is to consume, to compete, and to die. That story has been useful. It has driven certain kinds of achievement. But it has also produced the particular flavor of emptiness and anxiety that defines the inner life of so many people in the modern world. A gnawing sense that something essential is missing, that the map does not match the territory, that there is a dimension of experience that the official narrative has no place for, and therefore pretends does not exist. The large story, the one that the extraterrestrial evidence is pointing toward, that the contact experiences are transmitting, that the most advanced reaches of physics and consciousness research are beginning to articulate, says something entirely different. It says that consciousness is primary, that you are not an accident but an expression, that the universe is not indifferent but alive with intelligence at every scale, from the quantum foam at the foundation of physical reality to the civilizations that have been traversing the cosmos for timescales that make the entire span of human history look like a single afternoon. It says that the beings who have been present in our sky and in our deepest experiences are not invaders, not saviors, not gods in the ancient sense of arbitrary rulers demanding submission. They are, in the most precise possible sense, a mirror, a reflection of what humanity is in the process of becoming, held up by presences that have already traveled the road we are now walking, and that understand, in ways we are only beginning to grasp, where that road leads. What it leads to is contact. Not the contact of a spacecraft landing in a field, though that may come. The deeper contact. The contact between what you currently believe yourself to be and what you actually are. The contact between the isolated, bounded, defended sense of self that the small story requires and the vast, connected, multi-dimensional awareness that the large story reveals. That contact is the real disclosure. Everything else, the congressional hearings, the declassified documents, the whistleblower testimonies, is the outer layer of a process whose inner core is a transformation of human consciousness so fundamental that the civilization that emerges on the other side of it will be as different from the one we inhabit now as we are different from the civilizations that carved their encounters with the sky into the walls of ancient temples. This is not a distant prospect. It is not something reserved for future generations. It is happening now, in the lives of ordinary people who have made the choice to look honestly at the evidence, to follow the questions wherever they lead, and to allow the process of genuine inquiry to do what genuine inquiry has always done: expand the self that is doing the inquiring until it is large enough to hold truths that the smaller version could not accommodate. You are part of that process. The fact that you have watched this far, that something in you has stayed engaged through everything that has been laid out in this video, is not accidental. There are no accidental viewers here. The people who find their way to this content and stay with it are the people who are ready for it. And readiness in this context is not a passive state. It is an active orientation toward truth that has been building in you through your experiences and your questions and your refusal to be fully satisfied by the answers the small story offers for longer than you probably realize. So here is what comes next. Not as a prescription, but as an invitation. Go back to the beginning of this video and listen again, this time with the specific intention of noticing what you feel, rather than simply tracking what you think. Because the transmission in this content operates on more than one level simultaneously, and the level that tends to be most transformative is not the intellectual one. It is the level at which something in you recognizes something in what is being said, not because you are being told what to believe, but because you are being reminded of what you already know. Then go to the ancient records. Read the actual texts, not the secondary accounts. Read the Sumerian tablets. Read the Book of Enoch. Read the Vedic descriptions of the Vimanas. Read the testimony of David Grush and Luis Elizondo, and the pilots who have encountered craft that performed the impossible and reported it at personal and professional cost. Read Dr. John Mack. Read Whitley Strieber. Build your own relationship with the primary sources, rather than depending on any single interpreter, including this one. Because the goal here is never dependence. The goal is always your own independent capacity to navigate this terrain with clarity and discernment, and then bring what you find back here, to the comments, to the community of people who are doing this work alongside you. Because the isolation of the individual inquirer is one of the most effective mechanisms of suppression that exists. When people who are asking the same questions find each other, when they pool their research and their experiences and their insights, the collective intelligence that emerges is qualitatively different from anything any individual could produce alone. That collective intelligence is what this channel is building. And every person who shows up fully, who contributes their genuine perspective, who asks the real question rather than the safe one, makes it stronger. This is where we are. On the threshold of the most significant expansion of human self-understanding in recorded history. In possession of more evidence than any previous generation has had access to. In a moment when the institutional barriers to disclosure are weakening under the combined pressure of testimony, documentation, and the sheer impossibility of continuing to maintain a narrative that no longer holds together, and faced with a choice that every generation in every transformative moment in history has faced, the choice between the security of the familiar and the freedom of the true. Choose the true. It is more demanding. It is less comfortable. It offers no guarantees and no simple conclusions, but it is the only path that leads somewhere worth going. And the people who choose it, who have chosen it, who are choosing it right now, in this moment, by staying with this conversation instead of retreating into the easier stories, those are the people who will be ready. When the next layer of disclosure arrives, as it will, when the evidence becomes undeniable even to those who have invested most heavily in denying it, when the question of what to do with a truth this large becomes the most pressing practical question facing our civilization, the people who have already done the internal work, who have already expanded to accommodate the reality of a universe populated with intelligence, who have already begun the process of integrating this into a coherent understanding of what it means to be human. Those people will not be paralyzed. They will be prepared. Be one of those people. That is the invitation. That is the only ask that ultimately matters in this entire conversation. Leave the word contact in the comments right now, not as a gesture, but as a declaration. A declaration that you are here, that you are awake, that you are choosing to be part of this rather than watching it happen to other people. Share this video with someone who is ready, someone in your life who has been asking the questions in private and has not yet found the community that is asking them out loud. Hit the like button so that the algorithm understands that this content deserves to reach the people it was made for. The universe is older and stranger and more alive than the small story allows, and you are more than you have been given permission to believe. This video was one step in the direction of all three of those realities. The next step is yours. We will be here when you are ready to take it.